Okay, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to American Farmland Trust Farms Under Threat 2040 Choosing an Abundant Future technical webinar. This webinar will take about 1 hour, and before I introduce our panelists and we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with this GoToWebinar software. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website after the webinar. We'll also respond to all of you via email with any questions we didn't get a chance to answer, and links to some of the materials that we referenced today. You have all been muted. You should see a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. This is where you would, if you look at the orange arrow in the top left-hand corner, that's how you would minimize the control panel. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type those into the questions section on the toolbar, and they will be answered at the end of the webinar in our Q&A section. All right. Today, you will hear from 3 members of American Farmland Trust research team: Ann Sorensen, Senior Research Advisor; Ryan Murphy, GIS Manager; Teresa Nogary-McCrae, Spatial Scientist; and myself, Mallory Osteen, Georgia Program Manager. With that, we're going to get started with Ann, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mallory. Welcome to the technical webinar. We're very grateful that all of you have joined. We're going to be talking about Farms Under Threat 2040. Farms Under Threat is AFT's multi-year initiative to document the status of and threats to America's agricultural land while offering policy solutions to save that land. Next slide. Farms Under Threat is a long-term partnership between American Farmland Trust and USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. NRCS has provided our core funding, shared data, and provided technical assistance. Our previous analyses looked at the historic conversion of farmland and ranchland and evaluated its impacts on some of our best agricultural lands. Next slide. The analysis that we're talking about today is about choices. That's why we chose the subtitle, Choosing an Abundant Future. How we choose to develop our land as the population grows will have a huge effect on the future of agriculture. And these choices are critical for the environment and for society as well. We modeled 3 different development scenarios to 2040. That's what we'll be talking about. And we looked at the resulting impacts. Our technical mapping team included Justin Sirachi and Patrick Freeman at the Conservation Science Partners, and Yenhua Shi and Tyler Lark at the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They'll be available to answer any in-depth questions that come in through our Q&A. Next slide. So we're going to briefly discuss key results. We're going to look at the foundation of our modeling, which comes out of Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, our previous analysis. We'll look at how we did the future scenarios for Farms Under Threat 2040. We'll focus in on the methods for projecting developed land uses and the results. We'll talk about how we did the coastal flooding modeling. And we'll point out the resources and how the data can be used. Finally, we'll end up, if we have enough time, and actually answer questions. Next slide. On our current path of development, 18.4 million acres of agricultural land will be lost, fragmented, or converted to urban and highly developed land uses and low-density residential land uses between 2016 and 2040. But we have choices. Depending on our planning and policy choices, we could restrict conversion to 11 million acres of farmland and ranchland underdeveloped uses by 2040, or convert as much as 24.4 million acres by 2040. In addition, 450,000 acres of agricultural land along our coasts will be flooded by 2040. So how did we arrive at those numbers? Ryan, go ahead.
Thanks, Anne, and hello everyone on the webinar here. So we're going to start with the foundation for our Farms Under Threat 2040 work, which was our previous report. We call it the State of the States, looking at historical land use patterns and conversion of agriculture between 2001 and 2016. So the spatial analysis portion of this report had a few key components. One is an inventory of agricultural lands. Another is the quality of those lands for long-term food and fiber production. We call it the Productivity, Versatility, and Resiliency Index, or PVR. And a third was an assessment of the conversion of those lands to urban and highly developed, or UHD, and low density residential, or LDR lands. We'll be hearing those acronyms a lot. So I'll make sure to repeat the definitions and we'll all get clear on those together. Just a quick rundown of some of those components. So we have this is a map of our national agricultural land use assessment. And we looked at several agricultural land cover categories, including cropland, pastureland, rangeland, and woodland. I have a train going by my house right now, so you might hear that in the background. We also created this index of productivity, versatility, and resiliency, the PVR index, which is an assessment of land quality, the capability of lands to offer long-term food and fiber production. And finally, we looked at two types of land use conversion, urban and highly developed, or UHD, and low density residential lands. And it's worth spending a few minutes discussing the definitions for these two types of land uses. The developed land uses, UHD and LDR, exist on a spectrum from highly dense development in cities and large parking lots and urban and industrial infrastructure in the UHD side of things on the left-hand side of the figure here, to less dense development and large lot housing that interfaces with the rural land base and rural agriculture and forestry. So UHD is largely found in and around those cities and towns, but this category could also include rural industrial sites and warehouses. This is kind of what most researchers measure when they look at land conversion. And then low density residential land use is a new land use with the goal of identifying impacts of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. We'll talk more about that in a second here. We defined urban and highly developed lands based on the NLCD, or National Land Cover Database, land covers. And there's a spectrum of development there that we consider to be those UHD lands, from open space, which includes golf courses and public parks in urban areas, to developed high intensity lands, which represents the densest development patterns in the urban and peri-urban zones. All this information is derived from satellite imagery, and it's based on pixel sizes of 30 meters. So a little bit more on low density residential development, which is a unique land use class created for our Farms Under Threat work. This is a land use that could contain active agriculture, large lot housing, or other land uses. It combines county farm size and census block housing unit densities to identify areas where housing unit densities are increasing and potentially impacting the agricultural land base. One interesting finding from our State of the States work is that existing agriculture in this low density residential land use is far more likely to convert to urban and highly developed and completely out of agriculture in the future. So a quick note on the patterns of UHD and LDR. We talked about LDR, or low density residential development, as defined by census blocks. And here you can see in white, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but you can see in white the boundaries of the census blocks. And in orange is the low density residential areas that we've identified. This happens to be the future projected work that we've done. In red, you can see the urban and highly developed lands, which are defined more on the satellite imagery and are pixel based and less dependent on the census block boundaries. So after that recap of our previous work that serves as the foundation for the Farms Under Threat 2040 future scenarios, we'll do a brief overview of the 3 future scenarios that we developed. First is the business as usual scenario. So this is where historical trends that we measured between 2001 and 2016 continue out to 2040. It's a scenario where low density sprawl continues to encroach on agricultural lands, and farms are lost or pressured by changes in developing land uses. Next, we develop a scenario we call runaway sprawl, where we consider what might happen if the sprawl or dispersed development patterns increases or gets worse. This could be driven by high housing costs in urban areas, or more remote work opportunities, or rural broadband expansion, or concerns about rising crime, any number of reasons. It's a future characterized by a rapid increase in low density sprawl and low density residential development. And this means that there are few farms remaining in the scenario near cities in 2040. Finally, an alternative future that we might hope for that is best represented by a scenario we call better built cities. So this is a future where local development decisions might be the key determining factor in how much farmland is converted, with state and federal policy playing a supporting role. It's one where communities choose efficient growth, new development is denser and more livable, and many more farms are protected and remain for future generations. It also may include redeveloping existing urban spaces. So by the numbers, in terms of the future expansion of UHD and LDR by scenario, we see that business as usual here. It follows the historical rate and projects that out to 2040, with the one caveat being that it's adjusted for future population growth. The rate of low density residential conversion is the same as between 2001 and 2016, so it follows the historical rate. The runaway sprawl scenario, in terms of UHD conversion out to 2040, is the same as business as usual, but the low density residential conversion is 50% higher than business as usual, representing that low density expansion. And finally, with better built cities, we have a rate of urban and highly developed conversion that is 25% lower than the business as usual scenario, while low density residential conversion decreases substantially at 50% lower than the business as usual scenario. So after the scenario overview, we have a spatial modeling approach that is the same except for those adjustments in UHD and LDR expansion for each scenario. So here's a not so brief outline. The steps in our modeling approach are determining future demand in 2040 for both UHD and LDR conversion. We model a urban and highly developed suitability layer. Then we remove areas that are unlikely to be developed. And we create development probability layers, or the likelihood of transition to UHD and LDR. We allocate the UHD and LDR to the landscape in our future scenarios. And then we can calculate impacts on the agricultural land and the quality of the agricultural land for each scenario. A couple of key caveats here for this process. One, we were not able to incorporate local zoning into this analysis, although that would have been interesting. There's no nationwide standardized and consistent data set on local zoning ordinances that is available that we're aware of at this time. Another key caveat is that we were not able to incorporate water scarcity into these future scenarios, again, due to lack of good future modeling that we could include on a national scale. It's a critical issue in much of the West, we recognize that, and it could be the focus of future regional or national work, depending on data sets as they become available or as we create them. So how do we calculate future demand for our urban and highly developed and low density residential land use classes? Well, we take the average annual UHD increase in acres per year of a county. So this is done at the county level between 2001 and 2016. This is the total urban and highly developed land for the period divided by the 15 years between the two time points. And then we multiply that rate by the 24 years between 2016 and 2040. And finally, we adjust that by a population-driven adjusting factor, as population increase is a good indicator of high-density urban development. More buildings are needed to house a growing population. This population adjustment factor is based on a few sources and represents relative change of population growth between 2016 and 2040 and 2001 and 2016. For the 2001 and 2016 vintage, we use data from the US Census Bureau. And for the future projections out to 2040, we used state level projections from the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. Just a couple notes on these projections that both consider domestic and international migration, but it's unclear to what extent these predictions include climate-induced migration or future climate-induced migration. And we modified this adjustment factor to provide a conservative estimate of how population increases impact these developed land uses. We also did a separate demand calculation for low density residential development, where we remove the population adjustment factor, as there's not a clear link between low density residential development expansion and increases or decreases in population. There's a quick map of the source of the future population projections out to 2040. And again, this is data from the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service in the University of Virginia. So once we've defined demand, we create a urban and highly developed suitability layer based on where urban and highly developed lands are now. The urban highly developed suitability layer projected for each 30-meter pixel within a county. It's on a scale from 0 to 1, with higher values more suitable for development of this land use. It's based on the conditions where existing UHD land use as of 2016 was found, and combines many factors, including terrain, land value, proximity to existing urban areas, transportation networks and water resources, as well as other land resources, and the incorporation of nighttime light intensity. The suitability layer was built from these factors by utilizing a random forest model. And one key note is we did not create a separate low-density residential suitability layer. This was partially because some of the data sets to create LDR were not available, and also because urban and highly developed suitability is a strong predictor of low-density residential land use expansion. This is just all of the suitability layer inputs to the random forest model, their respective data resolutions, the vintage or year of the data set, and the data source. So after creating this suitability layer, we remove lands unlikely to be converted to UHD or LDR. Certain lands are unlikely to be urbanized or developed further. Some of these lands include existing urban and highly developed areas, protected areas from the protected lands database, federal protected areas, and also a product that we created, the Protected Agricultural Lands Database, that I'll talk more about in a minute. We removed federal lands, wetlands for urban and highly developed expansion, not for LDR, water bodies, and urban green spaces. These urban green spaces or residential forest areas are often classified as low-density residential development in previous farms under threat work. They're also unlikely to experience further development, and we remove them from the possibility of further conversion to UHD or LDR in our future scenarios. So a note on the Protected Agricultural Lands Database that we incorporated in this development restriction layer. We're really excited about it. We just released it publicly along with the launch of Farms Under Threat 2040. And it's a first of its kind database of protected agricultural easements across the country. Nearly 7 million acres of protected agricultural land are included in the PALD. And it's comprised of over 42,000 parcels. There's data from over 400 sources and 650 easement holders. Over 2 million acres are identified as PACE program easements, and over 800,000 acres of NRCS Agricultural Land Protection Program properties. And you can check that out at the URL here. There's an interactive web map where you can zoom in and see the protected lands that we've been allowed to share. So after the restriction layer, we create transition probability layers. And this probability is the product of the suitability that I discussed before and a historical land use conversion rate. So all of this is calculated at the county level, and the land use conversion rate specifically represents the amount of conversion to urban and highly developed lands for each individual land use in proportion to its total area between 2001 and 2016. So this captures local trends of converting specific land uses and land covers, including low density residential development as further conversion to urban and highly developed lands, as well as cultivated lands, forest, herbaceous areas, wetlands, and bare land. So the result is a layer showing probability of conversion for each pixel in the lower 48 states. And we did this probability calculation only within peri-urban and urban areas defined by nighttime light brightness. One of the reasons for this is outside of those areas, specific land uses vary substantially within a county, and this could lead to extremely high or low transition probabilities if all land uses are considered. These land uses in remote areas tend to remain unurbanized or converted further anyways and would have low transition probabilities anyways. Also, artificial nighttime lights used to define these boundaries are a good correlate of human activity. So finally, we get to allocating new UHD and LDR to the landscape. So this is an image of land cover in 2016 near Boise, Idaho. And in 2040, you can see the expansion of this, in this case, combined urban and highly developed and low density residential land uses. In general, in the allocation of these classes, new UHD is allocated first because it can only occur in areas that were because it can occur in areas that were previously low density residential development, while new low density residential development can only occur on previously unconverted land. So how does this look at the national scale for our business as usual scenario? You can see here that patterns are very similar. If you remember back to our state of the states land use map, you can see rings around urban areas of urban and highly developed and low density residential expansion. And these patterns are magnified so that we can see them at the national scale. We can also see another element of the Farms Under Threat 2040 work, coastal flooding, which Teresa will talk about in a few moments here. And we have a lot of results that are available in the report. I'll share how to get there in the resources section a little bit later. This is a map of acres of agricultural land converted to UHD and LDR at the county scale. And you can see that some of the areas in the Southwest where there's a lot of agriculture also align with areas where a lot of agriculture is converted, but many counties across the nation or the lower 48 states experience this conversion in 2040. And here's a different perspective, the percent of agricultural land converted in 2040 in the business as usual scenario. And it's a much different picture when we consider the percent of remaining agricultural land converted. We see some hot spots in the Southeast, where much of the remaining, I think up to 40% in some counties, remaining agricultural land is converted to UHD or LDR. So this is just a reminder of the urban and highly developed to low density residential spectrum before we get on to another interesting result of our work. We see that there's a difference in how the proportion of UHD and LDR conversion plays out at a regional level across the country. From east to west, there is more low density residential as a proportion of total conversion. And in the Pacific, urban and highly developed conversion dominates our future scenarios. And with these results, we can also overlay expansion of UHD and LDR to the nation's best land. If you remember, I mentioned the PVR index. We can use that index to identify the best land in the country for long-term cultivation and food production. We call this land nationally significant agricultural land. And this nationally significant agricultural land is over 50% more likely to be converted by 2040 than other lesser quality agricultural land. While it's concentrated, the nationally significant land is concentrated in certain parts of the country, every state has some, and every state has some conversion of that land. And although this is true in all three scenarios, in the business as usual and runaway sprawl scenarios, far more acres are converted than the better built cities scenario. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Teresa, who will talk about some coastal flooding.
Hi, nice to be here with you all. In addition to future development, we modeled lands impacted by sea level rise. So on this map, the future projected development, as in some maps that Brian has already showed you, is shown in red, and the lands impacted by sea level rise are shown in blue. Under the high emissions climate scenario that aligns with our current climate trajectory, so that's representative concentration pathway 8.5, sea levels are projected to rise by 7.5 inches by 2040. So we projected this rise in coastal areas following methods developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In brief, we first mapped the average height of the highest daily tide along the coasts, then added 7.5 inches. This produced a map of the elevation of high tides in 2040. We then used a digital elevation model to identify coastal areas that fall below this future high tide mark. Next slide, please. Unsurprisingly, California is the state with the most impacted farmland. In this screenshot from our Webapp of the Bay Area and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the left map shows land cover in the present day with gray as development and green as farmland. The dark blue in the right map shows the land that is projected to be underwater due to sea level rise by 2040. And again, the red is showing projected development. And there's much more fun to be had with the Webapp, which Brian is going to be walking you through in just another minute. Next slide, please. We quantified loss of farmland due to sea level rise via two pathways. First, as I described, we projected lands expected to be inundated, and then we quantified the amount of farmland within these areas. Second, we considered the effects of in-migration. When sea levels rise in coastal areas and existing development becomes flooded, new development will need to be built inland to replace it. We quantified the projected amount of flooded UHD and LDR areas, and then estimated the amount of inland farmland that would be converted when these areas are replaced. In doing so, we assumed that the same percentage of new conversion would occur on farmland as what we found in the business as usual projection. And this was done for each county on a county by county basis. We estimated that nationwide, about 450,000 acres of farmland and ranchland are at risk for being flooded by 2040. Of course, some places are going to adapt and build infrastructure such as levees to hold the water back, but it is still a substantial threat. Our estimates, however, do not include salinization, which is going to affect many, many more acres. Okay, back to you, Ryan.
See, get the camera on again here. So now for the exciting part. We threw a lot out you with the methods and overview and background of this work, and now I'm going to share how you can get to this information and how you can explore it yourself, and just the wealth of resources that we have to share. So number one, we have a web app, and I'm going to try to take you through that and show you all the resources that you can access through the web app now. Let's see. Yep, looks like that's working. So when you first land on our Farms Under Threat 2040 web app, you'll see this intro splash screen that contains a bunch of information about our project, about what we did, some very familiar by now acronyms, UHD and LDR, and a description of those, a number of links to be able to access a variety of resources here, as well as our previous work, the 2001 to 2016 historical production, historical analysis, excuse me. We've got a description, very brief description of each of the scenarios we ran through, as well as a farmland protection scenario that we did not discuss in this talk, but that we did for 10 metro areas across the country, which you can explore through the web app. And we also have a high-level overview of what we found, some actions that you can take to advocate for policies that protect and retain America's farmland and ranchland, and some other helpful information, as well as a way to sign up for updates and keep in touch with all that American Farmland Trust is doing to protect our country's farmland and ranchland. So there's a lot just in the splash screen, but we're going to go further here. Next, we get to the actual web app, where we see a couple of maps, some side-by-sides here, which will allow us to compare different scenarios. When you click on the map, you see both state and county statistics, which we'll get to in a moment here, and you can zoom in. Maybe I will try a different area here in Texas to compare different scenarios. I'll take a step back before I show you the scenarios here to show you a few options on the map itself. We have a 2016 land cover that we've created that represents a number of agricultural and other land cover classes, which you can see with the legend here. You also have the option of looking at a satellite or standard base map, depending on the scenario that you're comparing and what you're looking for. The different base maps might serve your purpose better. I'll return to the land cover here. You can zoom in. You can see quite a bit of detail. Select a scenario on the left-hand side. Maybe we'll select better built cities. Select one on the right-hand side, runaway sprawl, and really get a close look at the differences between these scenarios. Because I'm familiar with this area and the data, I can see right away that runaway sprawl includes a much larger amount of our projected low-density residential impacts. In addition to that, although we weren't able to include projected water scarcity in our future scenarios, we do have an overlay on these maps that allows you to project water scarce, or allows you to visualize water scarcity on the landscape. And you can kind of take a look and see the darker red colors represent where higher water scarcity may be found in 2040. And also the source of this data is available here, as well as a description. Turning that off. When you click on the map anywhere, you get both state and county level comparisons of urban and highly developed and low density residential lands for each scenario. You also get breakdowns in a few different ways here. You get how those expansions of UHD and LDR impacted the state's best agricultural land, and how those impacted different agricultural land cover types. As well as a very key stat here, how LDR, or low density residential development, may be a precursor to further conversion to urban and highly developed lands. In this case, in this area, LDR areas are 23 times more likely to be converted to UHD by 2040, which is a pretty compelling statistic. And finally, another opportunity to sign up for updates and keep in touch with all that AFT is doing, as well as our partners, conservation science partners, and University of Wisconsin-Madison. So with the website here, there's also a number of other resources you can access, including a how-to video. I won't click on that now. If you need some instructions or advice about how to walk through the website and access its different features. Also an opportunity to view the report, and an opportunity to actually request the spatial data that you see on the map. So if you were to click this link, it would take you to a form that you could fill out so we can get some information, and then you'd be given access to the data layers that are part of this project. In addition, you can see that you have a button here, download report. So for each state, you have an option to download a tailored report that includes a whole wealth of other information, as well as custom state specific maps for the business as usual scenario, information on economic impacts and labor impacts, the hardest hit counties, a description of the scenario and a comparison of the scenario set here, the LDR multiplier that we call it, which is how many more times likely agricultural land in these LDR areas are to be further converted to UHD. And then how much an alternative better built cities scenario may save if we consider smart growth practices growing out to 2040, as well as an assessment of agricultural impacts due to coastal flooding and some action items, and the link back to our overall website and set of resources. Let's just go back to the website here. You can also get to our main website and to the Farms Under Threat landing page to see a number of other resources there. So I won't go through these in depth, but we also do have some state-specific webinars coming up, and you can find those through our Farms Under Threat page. We have the Protected Agricultural Lands database and the Farmland Information Center, which is just a clearinghouse of all statistics on agricultural lands and agricultural land protection, another great resource. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Mallory, who will talk about how to use these data sets for land protection.
Thank you, Ryan. I do come from a local land trust professional background where I did use AFT's State of the States data in my land protection work. The data can be used in the following ways. So baseline documentation reports, you can document land quality with the PVR data found in the State of the States report. You can document recent conversion with the State of the States report between 2001 and 2016. You can document future conversion threat between 2016 and 2040 with our Farms Under Threat 2040 report. Can also identify parcel proximity to other protected lands with our PALD data. This data can also be used to target easement outreach with PVR data, including the map of nationally significant land and with future conversion threat. You can also identify resource needs in given areas and given counties and states for PACE programming, using the future conversion threat data. And you can work with state and local officials to inform local land use, county comprehensive plans and such with the future scenarios data as well. Next slide, please, Ryan. And if you're more curious about what some of this data is for your particular state or region and how you can collaborate with local officials and land trusts in your area, you can join our state-specific webinars. They are taking place throughout the summer and early fall. I have just added, or I will add now, a link to the chat to sign up for those. We are hosting those in 35 different states, so please join us and spread the word. All right, Ryan, next slide. Now we will move into a short Q&A session that'll take us to the end of the hour. So please enter any questions that you have into the chat. I'm going to welcome our panelists to join us on video if they are able, and we will answer your questions as they come in.
Okay, I see a question here. It says, how is your protected ag lands data set additive to the NCED? Anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the NCED, the National Conservation Easement Database, is a great resource for conservation easements across the country. It's got a lot of great spatial data, and we actually take from the NCED as part of the Protected Agricultural Lands Database. In addition, we've leveraged American Farmland Trust's reputation and connection with private land trusts and other agricultural land protection organizations to collect protected agricultural land areas that are not in the NCED. And we've also been able to, through that work, identify areas that are currently in the NCED, but that are not identified as specifically being protected agricultural lands. So we hope that the PALD, or Protected Agricultural Lands Database, will be an integrated resource with the NCED, that we've borrowed some of their structure of the data and some of the language that they use to describe protected lands. And I hope that we can pass data back and forth and be companion resources for those folks who are interested in protected lands across the country.
Thanks, Ryan. And I think that that also answered your second question. So let me know if it didn't.
attendees, we'll give a few more moments for questions to come in through the question.
I have one more. Sorry, Mallory. One more coming in is, Mallory, could you speak further to how a land trust might use this data and maybe have an example?
So baseline documentation reports when, evaluating conservation values of a given parcel. Also, when applications, so for example, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, the federal NRCS program, you have to identify proximity to protected parcels, also, the prime agricultural land, and also proximity to development, and all this can be found in our data sets. And then also the state 2-pagers are very helpful, and I would recommend in terms of working with county level officials to identify funding sources or need and opportunity for purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. The state analysis can be very helpful in analyzing the coming threats to farmland loss.
Great, thank you. I see another one coming in, perhaps. I have another question, which is, if you had polled easement data, how could you submit that to AFT to be included in that data set? Ryan, perhaps that's for you.
Wow, that's great. So right now, you could submit it to us through getting directly in touch with me, or maybe I can type it in the chat here. maps@farmland.org would be the email to get in touch with our GIS team, and we can then start a conversation about how to integrate that into the PALD.
Great, thank you. And another one from Kate Riley is, I guess I'll give this one to Yanhua, I know a few of us could answer it, but Ryan's probably tired of talking. Can you speak more to the census blocks versus pixels? Or Tyler or Yanhua, perhaps?
I can speak first. Yeah, we model the pixel-based modeling is for ESD, high density urban development, and for this block-based, census block-based is for low density residential area expansion, because the historical data sets we have, like FD data layers for 2001 and 2016 for low LDR, especially based on census block. So that's why we use the same modeling, scale for the future 2040.
Great, thank you. And a follow-up to that is, how does this impact the outcome? I don't know if anybody wants to take a crack at that.
Yeah, it doesn't affect the overall amounts of conversion very much, but what it does do is it affects the spatial patterns on the landscape, and so the LDR projections will match what we often see and observe, which is these larger blocks, which are census blocks, block groups that kind of match larger, say, subdivisions or something like that, whereas the urban high density is more compact and modeled at the pixel level, and so it can kind of conform to different shapes and objects more tightly.
Wonderful. Okay, another one is, if we want to use this data for land protection work but don't have internal GIS capacity, can AFT help? And I'm going to send that to you, Ryan.
Yeah, I think that we can help either provide that data. So right now, the Protected Agricultural Lands database is live and a public web map, or what we can share publicly. Some of it we have to keep private at the request of the landowner or land trust. But so you don't need any GIS capacity to be able to go and view that and look at satellite imagery and look at your prospective parcel in relation to existing protected agricultural lands. If you wanted to do more analysis or create custom maps, you can get in touch with us again at maps@farmland.org.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that's all the questions we have. Mallory, did you have anything else to wrap up?
I don't believe so. You'll all get an email from us that has the recording to this webinar, all of the links to the data and reports and web mapping tool that we mentioned. And yeah, thank you for joining us. And please join us for the state-based webinars coming up in your region. With that, we will end. Take care, all.
Thank you.